Welcome back to Beyond Classified. I'm your host, Chris Matthew. Tonight, my guest is Marguerite Rigoglioso. Before I bring her on, I want to remind everyone that this year's Forbidden Knowledge News Con, April 2nd, 3rd, and 4th, with 12 amazing presenters, is now going to be held exclusively on Rokfin. You can just go to rokfin.com and sign up for a subscription. You'll get access to this year's full conference, last year's conference, our premium content, and all the content creators that are on Rokfin. You're going to get all their premium content as well. Like I said, just go to rokfin.com and sign up there. If you go to forbiddenknowledge.news, you can check out this year's lineup and find out all about the conference. Tonight, I want to welcome Marguerite Rigoglioso. She is the foremost authority on the history of virgin birth and the author of the bold new book, The Mystery Tradition of Miraculous Conception, Mary and the Lineage of Virgin Births. She taught many graduate and undergraduate courses in the US and UK, but happily left academia in 2012 to find her own Seven Sisters Mystery School, through which she's been teaching about the sacred feminine and mentoring clients on the evolutionary spiritual path. Marguerite, welcome. How you doing?
Very well. Thanks for having me, Chris.
Yeah, so looking forward to it. We're going to be discussing your book today, The Mystery Tradition of Miraculous Conception. And this is a fascinating information. It takes a whole new look at the birth of Christ and the fact that there's an entire mystery tradition surrounding miraculous conception, which is very fascinating. I'd like to know, when did you start looking into this and really what led you to do so?
Yeah. Well, it like so many things, it came to me in a flash. This was back in, I think, 2001, when I was researching ancient Greek goddesses and the goddesses Demeter and Persephone. And I read a book by this Sicilian scholar who said that Demeter gave birth to Persephone in a virgin birth fashion, parthenogenetically, not with Zeus. And the way she was talking about this, I just went, whoa, I think women were doing this, right? It was one of those intuitive knowing moments. And then I started finding the only other piece that I found about this, it was in Drunvalo Melchizedek's volume, The Ancient Secret of the Flower of Life. And in one of those two volumes, he said that Thoth, the god Thoth, had told him that Mary actually did give a virgin birth, that it was real, but he didn't really go into it. So I'm like, wow, verification. And then I just kind of, I knew that I wanted to write my dissertation at the California Institute of Integral Studies on Greek priestesses. I did not at that point know that it was about virgin birth. But so I started to look at all these ancient references to Greek priestesses. And because I had that intuitive flash in mind, oh my gosh, I started finding mountains of information that virgin birth was an actual real thing in ancient Greece. And then I started looking into it and I realized there was evidence that it has gone on all over the world. My focus was the ancient Mediterranean world. And of course, my understanding about Mary and what that was all about swiftly followed. But my initial work was just looking at ancient Greece, maybe a little bit North Africa and the Egyptian tradition. And then I knew about Virgin Mary, but I didn't include that in my dissertation. It was going to be like a whole other thing. And it really took years before I finally got to do this book. It's coming out 2021. I really started this work 20 years ago. I have taught these courses on Mother Mary, but this is the first time where I'm, it's together here in this book.
Very cool. So could you give us a brief overview or premise of your book so that everybody can get an idea of what it's about?
Yeah. Well, it's that Mary was an actual trained priestess in divine conception, that she was trained by her mother, and she was already born this way from her own mother, which is something that we find out about in an apocryphal gospel known as the Infancy Gospel of James. Whose infancy? Mary's. Who is James? One of the sons of Joseph, who is supposed to be an eyewitness to all these things that happened with Mary. And so what we learn in that gospel is that Anne was already knowing, her mother was already knowing how to give divine birth. She was already calling on her ancestor Sarah, who gave birth to Isaac in a miraculous way. And then she had Mary trained by priestesses of the Hebrew temple in this practice, both in Anne's home and then in the temple itself. And that this tradition spans way back to Sarah as the founding mother of the Hebrew tradition. But the other women have these kinds of in the Hebrew tradition, like Zipporah, the wife of Moses, and Rachel and Rebecca, that they have similar stories too. But that this is part of a whole like network in the ancient Levant coast and the ancient Mediterranean world of women who knew how to do this practice for the purpose of bringing in high holy beings to the planet, because this specialized way of conceiving in a seemingly counter-biological way, but not really, but a seemingly counter-biological way, was what was needed to connect with the astral intelligences that would allow a very high level beings to come to the planet. And these beings were always had some form of supernatural power. Some of them were more advanced and ethical and heart-centered and amazing, like Jesus, and some of them were lesser so, which we can see throughout the ancient Mediterranean world, like Alexander the Great. He has a story of being born in this way as well. So that's kind of the basic premise of the book. And I go into how Mary was trained, how her mother gave birth to her, signs that her mother was in this lineage, how Mary conceived Jesus, what happened to her after she conceived. And the story goes all the way up to the end of the infancy gospel, where the Holy Family is basically on the run from the marauding Roman forces that are like, wow, kill these people.
That's fascinating. Now, do you think this is some sort of bloodline thing that
Yes.
Mary may have been part of a sacred bloodline?
Absolutely, because it says in this gospel that it's apocrypha. So the Catholic Church decided that it wasn't official when it came to these councils that they were deciding. They're like, no, we're not going to make this one official. It has too many things, basically, that we don't like, basically that threaten, patriarchal authority. Read, and so. Yeah, it says in there that when they were looking for these virgins for this particular weaving of the temple veil, meaning they were looking for a virgin birth ritual. They were looking for women to do this virgin birth ritual. They were looking for people of specific bloodlines. They had to be related to David, the house of David.
That's very interesting. Now,
Yeah.
could you tell us a little bit more about how you came to the conclusion that it was actually a miraculous conception and that she was a virgin? What kind of evidence and what were the sources that you went to find this?
Right. So mainly the source is this infancy gospel of James, which, although the Catholic Church rejected it as an official gospel, guess what? They used it as the basis for all of the feast days to Mary, like her birth, her presentation in the temple, her, like these other things, her conception by her mother Anne. It's like, where and when in Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John do we hear about these things? Why is the Catholic Church having these feast days? Where'd they get the info? Hello, the infancy gospel of James, right? So what I do is I look at that, and because I had done a ton of research throughout the whole ancient Greco-Roman world, I was able to see that, wow, when James, the author, is talking about this symbol, it really signifies that this was going on. And it's related to how all of these priestesses of ancient Greece divinely conceived as well. So that's like the basic general answer to your question. We can go deeper if you want.
Yeah, let's go a little deeper because I know a lot of these stories from the Bible are basically taken from earlier mythos and earlier stories, from Egyptian to Sumerian. So yeah, talk a little bit more about, the origins of this.
Okay. So, you know, what what this gospel does tell us is that Mary was a virgin. So I understood that that had to be a prerequisite for virgin birth or parthenogenesis from the Greek tradition, because all of these priestesses either had to be maidens, never having had sex, or they had to become celibate again in order to be at these priestesshoods, like the Delphic oracle, who at that point in the later days, she had to be 50 years or older, but she had to restore her virginity by becoming celibate again. Okay. But a lot of these younger women were virgins, all over the ancient Mediterranean world. In Rome, the Vestal virgins were virgins. Okay. The reason why is not because they're good girls. It's because virginity is a biotechnical necessity when you're doing a specific operation, such as parthenogenesis. All right. Because the woman needs to be connecting with various astral or star energies in a pure way. The minute a male enters her body, it shifts the energy, and it's not quite possible for her to have a conception in the highest way possible that Mary did. Later in this tradition of divine birth, the women did start having sexual intercourse with the priest kings, okay? But it was like a devolution of the process, because initially these women were kind of either just conceiving in and of themselves, parthenogenesis, female daughters, or conceiving of themselves males, which is what Mary did. But later, as these astral beings started encroaching on the space, because they sniff it out, right? Like dogs, they can sniff out what is going on with these high priestesses in their astral rituals. And they're like, hey, let's get in on that. So the Zeuses of the world, okay? The watchers of the world, in the Bible and so forth. These are all male entities that are able to sniff out what's going on with these priestesses and kind of come in and hijack the virgin birth conception process. In a later stage of it, because the priestesses started getting strong-armed and controlled, they kind of got conscripted into having these astral sexual encounters with these gods. Okay. And this is leading to, this starts getting into the hybriding programs where the women's wombs are being used, okay, to bring in these astral beings. The whole notion of divine birth of an avatar started getting really polluted, and you have things like the Nephilim coming in, okay? And then in a later phase, the priestess, there's a male priest who actually embodies the god that used to be just on the astral plane with the priestess over here in her ritual, but now he's having sexual intercourse with her, which accomplishes two things. I mean, he is able to bring the energy of the god into the priestess, but then he's able to claim the child for the male line. Whereas prior to this, it was only the females who would be able to be owning these children, responsible for them, raising them, and etc. So in this infancy gospel, I see all these codes and signs that Mary was engaged in a divine birth ritual. And I can talk about some of those if you want.
Yeah, definitely. Let's hear about it.
Okay. So what we know of from the Greek tradition is that there was a light matter interface. I found evidence that these conceptions were understood to take place through a flash of light. Okay, when these priestesses of Greece and other places originally were involved in this. So we see indications of this in what Mary goes through in her ritual. How they describe it, in how this James describes it in the infancy gospel, is that this is a weaving ritual, that they are weaving the temple veil. But what I know, and I'm able to bring in all of the research I did and all of the ancient texts from Greece, weaving is a metaphor for parthenogenesis, or for conception, right? So these women were going to weave the temple veil, but really what was happening was they were engaged in a group ritual. There were 8 of them, and that's what the gospel tells us. There was Mary and 7 others. And they each chose by lot a different thread, a different colored thread. But what I gather is that the meaning of the colored thread indicated what they were supposed to, what each one was supposed to do in the ritual. And Mary picked the threads of purple and red. Okay. And Elizabeth, her cousin, was actually, it was her aunt. It was her mother's sister, Elizabeth, who gave birth to John the Baptist. She was involved in the same ritual. So this is telling us that those 2 women were actually conceiving at the same time in the same ritual. Elizabeth also had chosen the scarlet thread. So that seems to be a significator. Those are the 2 women who are going to actually do the conceiving. The other 6 women are holding the space, right?